Hello and welcome to the video version of the Tax Notes Talk podcast. I'm David Stewart, Editor-in-Chief of Tax Notes Today International. This week, a very special episode, or as seen on TV. For many of us, television is an escape from reality, especially during tumultuous times. But sometimes what's happening in the lives of our favorite TV show characters resembles what's happening in our own lives. So of course the subject of taxes has come up on television, in fact many times in sitcoms. So much so that one professor has cataloged the episodes in the pages of tax notes. And with that, I'm joined by Duke Law Professor Lawrence Zelenak. Larry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be with you.
Can you tell listeners a bit about yourself and what brought you to write about taxes and sitcoms?
Well, I've been teaching in law schools for teaching tax in law schools for a long time. I guess since the mid 1980s. And I've always had a pretty strong interest in pop culture, which is, I suppose, a way of saying I've always spent a lot of time watching television. Just kind of randomly, I came across one or two sitcom episodes, not because I was looking for them, but just because I was watching sitcom episodes that involved tax. And that made me curious about how many such episodes there might be. And so must be about 15 years ago now, I started a research project. It's the kind of project that I'd recommend that professors start only after they have tenure, because I don't think you're going to get tenure on the basis of a project like this. Looking for as many tax-related sitcom episodes as I could find. It involved research techniques that I'd never learned in law school. And
What sort of techniques did you have to employ for this?
Oh my gosh, it was kind of everything. I think if I was doing it now, it would be somewhat easier. I think there's more information online now about such things than there was then. But the single best source was a website called tv.com, which had very brief 1 or 2 sentence plot descriptions of almost every sitcom episode ever. But for the problem was that for some reason those plot descriptions were opaque to Google. So you couldn't just ask Google to find all of them automatically for you. You had to go sort of manually through every episode description of every show you were interested in. So if it occurred to me, for example, hey, I bet there's there might be a tax episode in All in the Family, you had to go through all of those to find it. Then, of course, that was just the first step, because that would alert me to the existence of the episode, but it wouldn't mean I could find the episode. So again, most of these are available for streaming now, but it was harder then. Some of them were available on DVD. This was kind of pre-streaming. Some were available on DVDs. A lot weren't. And I discovered that the 3 great archives were the Library of Congress, the Radio and Television Archives in New York, and the UCLA Film and Television Library, and made trips to all 3 of those, which was a lot of fun. Research has gotten a lot easier since then, not only because the tools have gotten better, but because now people tell me, I'll get an email every so often, hey, you missed this episode, or this one just came out, and that's been great. One other thing I should mention is that the one time I really hit a gold mine was that there was something, I think it was called Old Time Radio, that had actually on its own collected on a disc about 24 radio episodes, and that tax-related sitcom radio episodes. So that sort of happened all at once.
So your list of sitcoms goes all the way back to the 40s and the radio plays. Is there some sort of history lesson we can learn from it?
Well, I think the really interesting historical accident, Dave, is that the income tax became a mass tax that applied to most of the population only in World War II. It had existed, of course, since 1913, but between 1913 and the early 1940s, usually it applied to only about the 5 or 10% of the population, which made it maybe not that good a topic for pop culture. Sitcoms emerged on radio in the very late 1930s. 30s. I think usually the first radio sitcom family is said to be the Aldrich family, which I debuted in 1930. The first sitcom show is the Aldrich family, which debuted in 1939. And so within just a very, very few years, you had the income tax emerging as a mass tax and sitcoms emerging at almost exactly the same time. And from that very beginning, the sitcoms have provided commentary on the income tax. So we have a perfect chronological match between these two phenomena, and it's made for some really interesting sitcom episodes.
Wow. So how much time did you really devote to this this passion project of yours?
Oh gosh, well, just to watch and listen to all the episodes would be about 50 hours, or maybe a little less because of the ads. 100 episodes times half an hour each. I wasn't billing this to anyone, so I didn't keep track, but it was certainly hundreds and hundreds of hours. But it was a labor of love, and a lot of the shows are really good, even apart from the tax angle. So it was not unpleasant by any means.
So how are taxes coming up in these otherwise fun shows? I mean, taxes are fun, of course, but can you give some examples?
Sure. So I suppose that two ways of thinking of categorizing the shows are at what stage in the tax process that the show sort of enters, and the other is what particular substantive tax issues are involved. So on the process side, it's almost entirely two different stages, and this isn't surprising. One is tax return preparation, and the other is audits, which, by the way, I have to say that the audit rate on television is orders of magnitude higher than the audit rate in real life. But they're almost all either tax return preparation shows or audit shows for kind of obvious reasons. I mean, in that connection, one thing that I think is interesting is the individual federal income tax, over this time frame we're talking about, which is basically since 1940 on, has most of the time raised about half of all of the federal tax revenue, and then if you throw in state tax revenue altogether, of all the taxes people pay, federal individual income tax is significantly less than half, right? But if you were arriving from another planet, we'll get to Third Rock from the Sun later, but and trying to figure out what the U.S. income tax system was like from watching sitcoms, you would conclude that the only tax that existed was the federal individual income tax, and the reason, I think, pretty clearly is because it requires so much more taxpayer participation than any of the other taxes. To get back to your original question, the other way you can sort of categorize the shows is not by the stage of the process at which they are investigating, but rather the substantive tax issue. And I'd say there's three things that mostly come up there. One, and this won't surprise anybody, one is income inclusions. And there's both sort of substantive issues about whether windfalls are taxable, that comes up, whether in-kind income is taxable. There's also what you might call cheating issues, whether something is reported to the IRS by the third-party payer, and whether or not you should report it on your return if you think the IRS doesn't know about it. A lot of deduction issues. Pretty much every deduction you could that would occur to you as a widespread deduction comes up in the sitcom. So there are shows involving the alimony deduction, shows involving the charitable deduction, shows involving business expense deductions, and so on. Another thing that comes up a lot is illegitimate refunds. So given that a lot of people's main sort of direct interaction with the IRS is not paying taxes because those are withheld automatically, but rather the IRS sends you a check, not surprisingly, there are a lot of episodes where people are trying to take advantage of that to get bigger checks from the government than they should. So that's a third category.
Now, have you noticed any sort of change? You've been cataloging these for many years. Have you noticed any sort of change over time of the way taxes show up in these episodes?
Yeah, I think the biggest change over time is that in the 1940s and 1950s, to use my term, not a term that ever shows up in the shows, fiscal citizenship was a really big deal. That is, the shows talked a lot about, how Justice Holmes famously said, and it's actually sort of etched over the IRS 1111 Constitution Avenue building in Washington, D.C. Taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. That came out in a lot of the 1940s and 1950s sitcom episodes. There's a Ozzie and Harriet radio show from the late 1940s where Ozzie is about to mail his income tax return, and he's been not too happy while he was preparing it. But a neighborhood girl who's been learning civics in school sees him at the mailbox, and she says, "Oh, there you are, about to file your tax return, Mr. Nelson. You're happy to do it. No grumbling from you. You say, 'Here it is, Uncle Sam. Take it. There's a lot more where that came from. You're 100 million Americans, Mr. Nelson.'" And although there's a laugh after that because she's from the laugh track, because she's obviously a bit over the top. But at the same time, it seems pretty seriously intended as well. There's a Honeymooners episode, the great Jackie Gleason sitcom from the early 1950s, where he complains as he's filling out his tax return because of how complicated it is, which, by the way, is another theme we can talk about. But at the end of the show, he says, I didn't mean all that bad stuff I said about taxes. We should be happy to pay taxes. We're living in the greatest country in the world. There's really a lot of that in the 50s and going up to the early 1960s. There's also, sort of in connection with that, two different episodes, one from the late 50s called Hey Jeannie, involving a Scottish immigrant, and then another from the early 1960s, the Bill Dana Show, involving a Mexican immigrant, both of whom decide that their income tax liability is too small, given how great a privilege it is to be able to live in this wonderful country. And I think the later show probably stole the plot from the first one, but still. And they both decide that they need to send in more than their actual tax liability as a tip to the federal government because they appreciate the privilege of living in the United States so much. That pretty much disappears, I'd say, by the 1970s. It comes back kind of oddly in 2006 in a My Name is Earl episode, where the sort of punchline of the serious, not joke punchline, of the whole episode is that tax paying is as much a privilege as an obligation because of the things government does for the citizens. But that theme almost disappears. I suppose the other big change is exemplified by what I think of as the three great working class sitcoms, or you might have to throw The Simpsons in as a fourth, but I can say that the three great live action working class sitcoms anyway.
Sure.
Which are the Honeymooners in the 1950s, where there's actually two tax episodes, and in both of them, Ralph is just scrupulously honest.
Now then, next here's item income from gambling winnings. You mean to tell me they tax gambling winnings? Sure, it's income, ain't it? Let's see, I've won about $25 throughout the year playing pool. $25 shooting pool. Then I got that first prize over at Salvatore's Pizzeria. Yeah? High score on the pinball machine. They gave me that horse with the stomach in its clock. I mean, the clock in its stomach.
Let's see.
That was worth about $15.
Horse
with Clark and stomach.
And then there's an episode of All in the Family called Archie's Fraud, which kind of gives away the plot, from the early 1970s, where Archie is exposed in front of his family as having driven a taxi on the weekends for $700 or $800 worth of tips, or that he didn't report.
So you didn't report that as income, huh, Archie? That's fraud.
What are you talking about, fraud? You telling me you declared all your tips last year?
Yeah, all of it. $470 worth.
Get out of here. You told me you made that much by Easter. So by December, you must have made $1,200. So don't be throwing no stones, see? Because you're a worse crook than me.
Although Archie cheats, which Ralph never would have done, the rest of the family, including Edith, who, dingbat though she may be, is the moral compass of the show, is so scandalized by this that everybody persuades Archie that he needs to go down to the IRS office and basically confess. And coming up finally to a Roseanne episode from 1990 called April Fool's Day, in which Dan and Roseanne are preparing their tax return on April 15th. They know that she earned several $100s selling magazine subscriptions during the year. They want to report that only if the government knows about it. Then they end up going down to the IRS office because this is just slightly pre-internet and they can't get through on the phone. And they finally find out that the amount was small enough that there wouldn't have been a 1099, so they decide not to report it. So you have one show, Honeymooners in the 1950s, scrupulously honest taxpayer. Another show, All in the Family, about a decade and a half later. Archie cheats, but everybody else is honest, and they shame him, and he guesses it's just desserts. To Roseanne, where it's not even up for discussion whether or not you cheat. Obviously, you cheat if you think you can get away with it. And while you can find honest and dishonest taxpayers in every time period, because after all, a lot of what these shows are about is bringing out the character, the personalities of the individual characters. Although Ralph in the 1950s was scrupulously honest, Sergeant Bilko, played by Phil Silvers, was on another tax episode and at the same time being tremendously dishonest. And there's a lovely Simpsons episode from the late 1990s called "A Trouble with Trillions," which juxtaposes Homer's tax return preparation style.
I put the tax forms on top of your to-do pile a month ago.
I have a to-do pile? Marge, how many kids do we have? Oh, no time to count. I'll just estimate. 9.
Homer, you know we don't have...
Shut up. If I don't hear you, it's not illegal.
With Ned Flanders, who decides not to deduct cash register ink from his store, the Leftorium, because he enjoys the smell, and wakes up on the stroke of midnight on January 1st and prepares his tax return. So you could cite honest and dishonest taxpayers in every period. Nevertheless, I think if you watched all 100 episodes in chronological order, which would be a great way to spend a day or two, I think you would come away with the impression that overall, people are a lot more willing to cheat than they used to be, and people are a lot less impressed by the benefits of government or notions of fiscal citizenship than they used to be. Let me throw one more thing at you in that respect about the connection between taxes and the benefits of government. So there's another immigrant show, a radio show, Life with Luigi, from the mid-1950s, where there's a discussion about, well, what do we get in return for taxes? And the answer is, basically, it's a Ned Flanders answer. Oh, the Army, the Navy, the streets, the veterans support, and so on. And then, fast forward to an episode of Ellen, Ellen DeGeneres' show from the mid-1990s.
Wow, they sent me a check for $5,000. You're kidding. Well, this is clearly a mistake. I'm going to have to give it back.
Give it back to the government? What did they ever do for you?
Well, roads, national parks, PBS. I mean, I don't watch, but I've heard good things about Nova.
Better yet, maybe back to Ned Flanders in that same episode. As he's preparing his return, one of the boys, Rod and or Todd, ask him,
Daddy, what do taxes pay for?
Oh, why, everything. Policemen, trees, sunshine. And let's not forget the folks who just don't feel like working, God bless them.
From a very sort of heartfelt notion that you know, taxes are the price we pay for civilized society, we get to these you know, kind of jokey, ironic notions that taxes pay for sunshine and PBS.
So would it be fair to say that the reflection of the depictions of people paying their taxes in these shows is sort of a mirror on the way the greater society is looking at these issues?
Oh, I think so. I mean, it's. I think you could make a pretty good argument that if you're looking for something in pop culture that sort of holds a mirror up to society, you could do a lot worse than sitcoms. I mean, yeah, I can't prove this, of course. I can cite other people who have said it, but none of us can really prove it. But yeah, I think sitcoms are a terrific, you know, mirror to what's going on in society. And I think the reason that, you know, belief in fiscal citizenship has waned and willingness to cheat on taxes has increased is because of, I think sitcoms are reflecting some real change in society.
Now, are these shows talking about, like, I know there's been some things about return preparations and such. Are they discussing specific issues within tax, or is it more of a generalized setting for the story?
Well, as you could imagine, there aren't too many that get into detail on substantive tax issues, but there are a lot of episodes where the plot turns on some aspect of taxation. There's a very nice Odd Couples episode from 1973 called The Ides of April, where initially Felix gets audited, but he, without quite realizing what he's doing, he says, "I'm the most honest taxpayer in the world. You shouldn't be auditing me. You should be auditing my roommate Oscar, who's an incredible slob and pays no attention to how he fills out his tax return." And because he says this, they decide to audit Oscar, and it turns out that Oscar has a big deficiency, which he doesn't have the money to pay, until at the very end of the episode, Felix runs in and says, Oscar had these huge alimony deductions, which, because he was so slovenly about the way he prepared his tax return, he never bothered to take. Actually, the government owes him a refund. So there's shows about business expense deductions as well. One thing you find in these old episodes is that plots tend to repeat on the shows that ran a long time because they did so many episodes a year. Like usually they were doing, in the 50s and 60s, they were doing 39 episodes a year. And if you have a long-running show, to come up with, you know, literally hundreds of new ideas gets hard after a while. So the Jack Benny show, first on radio and then on television, did I think 4 episodes altogether with basically the same plot, which was that friendly IRS agents show up at his house to ask him about his tax return because they're concerned that he hasn't claimed enough business expense deductions.
Well, then, we'd like to talk to you about this deduction.
Deduction?
Yes, this figure denoting the amount you spent on entertainment last year must be a mistake.
Fantastic. Well, I can't help it. That's what I spent.
$19?
So he explains, yeah, that's really right. I never spend money even as business expense deductions. That's why I don't claim them. But so you can find shows about the charitable deduction. You can find shows about entertainment expense deductions. There's a Twilight Zone episode. I know I'm sort of cheating here because nobody thinks the Twilight Zone is a sitcom, but about 10 or 20% of the Twilight Zone episodes actually are sitcomish. This is one of them. It's called The Man in the Bottle. It's from 1960. And this is not about a deduction, but about an income inclusion. And the the whole plot turns on the question of whether or not windfalls are taxable, which, as I'm sure you and the viewers know, that they are in the United States, but there are other income tax systems in other countries where they are not. And most people are sufficiently unfamiliar with the taxation of windfalls because they've never gotten any, or at least big ones, that they may not be aware of this rule. So anyway, this couple that's having great difficulty in making ends meet is visited by a genie in a bottle who gives them several wishes, and their major wish is for $1 million, but they forget to wish that it be tax-free. And so an IRS guy shows up and tells them it's taxable, and he says your tax liability on the $1 million is $907,000, which was a little high that's not quite right in terms of marginal tax rates in 1960, but you know what? It's pretty close. The actual tax would have been around $850,000. So that episode, for example, looks at both the taxability of windfalls and high marginal tax rates that prevailed at the time of the show. There's one of my favorites that I haven't mentioned yet is the Green Acres Hooterville refund fraud episode from the early 1970s, which is about net operating losses, basically, if you wanted to put it into a substantive category. But anyway, for people who aren't familiar with the show, Oliver Wendell Douglas, high-powered New York lawyer, decides he really wants to become a farmer and moves to the most backwards place in America, where they still think that Calvin Coolidge is president. And he picks up his tax refund check at the post office where all of the other farmers are sitting around the Cracker Barrel.
Mr. Drucker?
Morning, Mr. Douglas. Oh, I got a letter for you. Looks important.
Where's it from?
Washington, D.C.
You been writing after letter to Herbert Hoover again?
It's from the Treasury Department.
Oh, they must have found out about you still. Look, instead of us all guessing what it is, why don't we open it and see?
I'll open it for you, Mr. Douglas.
I'll open it.
Hey, this is a check for $84.72.
If you don't mind, it's signed by the Treasurer of the United States. Good eye, please.
He's right, Mr. Douglas.
It's a refund on my income tax. What's that? It's a tax you pay on your income. When did that go into effect? You mean you never heard of the income tax? How could we? We never had no income.
They misunderstand his explanation and think that what he has told them is if you lose money during the year in your business, the government will refund you, which means they will send you a check for the amount of money that you lost. And the farmers end up getting, in the aggregate, several $100,000 worth of refund checks. They're not totally wrong. I mean, there is something called net operating loss carryovers, but they sort of misunderstand exactly how far it goes. So there's all kinds of stuff. Most of the episodes involve some substantive issue or other, but none of them go real. Oh, I'll give you one more that I like a lot. From the Andy Griffith Show, Aunt B goes on a game show in Hollywood, and when she comes back, she's visited by an IRS agent. This is very odd for two reasons, but this kind of goes to the point that these shows don't always get things right technically. First of all, the agent shows up like a week after she's been on the show in the same year that she was on the show, so she hasn't even had a chance to file a return yet, right? And secondly, he doesn't talk to Aunt B, he talks to Andy, which is very peculiar. But the point of it is, all these things she won, the washer and the dryer and the free trip and all that, they're all taxable, which was news to her.
But they gave her those prizes free.
Exactly. And they're considered a cash flow to the recipient.
Do any of these betray a writer who seemed to have an axe to grind about some issue they were dealing with?
Great question. Not much. No, I can't think of a single one where I got that impression from the show. And in fact, one of the things that's striking about even the later episodes is IRS employees are only rarely depicted in seriously negative lights. For the most part, I would say the taxpayers come off a lot worse in these episodes than the IRS.
So I guess I did want to ask about that. Is the tax profession portrayed in a fair light?
So let me break that into two parts. One is the non-government tax profession, tax lawyers and accountants. And what's really striking about that is those people basically don't exist. That I just this morning I was going back over my summaries of the 100 episodes or so, looking for anything where a tax lawyer or an accountant or a return preparer showed up, and there are almost no such. I think maybe that's partly a function of the fact that you get more interesting sitcom situations if taxpayers prepare their own returns and aren't represented by lawyers at audit. But for whatever reason, they're basically missing in action. That has started to change for some reason just in the last decade. And there are the best one, which I just love, is a short bit from Portlandia of about 7 or 8 years ago, where Carrie, one of the two lead characters, is dating a tax lawyer, and she says, I think it's great to be dating a tax lawyer. I actually think tax lawyers are really sexy. And then it turns out that what he really wants to be is a guitarist in a rock band, and she finds that not attractive at all, and they stage an intervention where several people, including two actual music stars, tell him the world has enough rock musicians. What the world really needs is good tax lawyers.
I'm Annie. I have a band called St. Vincent. I tour. I'm a professional musician. When I was little, I loved Lauryn Hill, right? Everybody, miseducation, who hasn't heard that record, it's great. Where is she right now? In the news? In jail for tax evasion. You think she had a good tax lawyer behind her?
Obviously not.
He's probably playing bass in her band.
The last part of that episode is he's doing a one-man show where there's a marquee in front of a theater that says, the name of this character. And I think it's the name of the show is 1099s or something like that. And they show him just talking on the phone with a client while he's talking about tax issues, and the audience is applauding wildly. So that's a wonderfully positive depiction of a tax professional. But what's striking is until very recently there have been almost no such depictions. But there have been a lot of depictions, and I don't mean there haven't been positive ones. I mean there just haven't been any, period. All along there have been depictions of IRS officials, and I think what's really striking is, for the most part, they're depicted pretty positively. There are exceptions. In the Roseanne episode, which overall may be my favorite episode. It's just I recommend it to anyone who finds this topic at all interesting. When they go down to the IRS office, there's this extremely rude, snooty IRS official who tells Roseanne that you didn't have to come down here to ask this question because the answer is right there in the 1040 instructions. And she says, where? I didn't find it. And he points it out to her and says, there it is in black and white. I'm sorry there are no pictures. And then there's something which is in a class by itself, a show by the name of Alice, where the lead character is a waitress struggling to meet ends meet, who gets audited, and the auditor tells her, you owe a lot of tax money, but I could make it all go, puts his hands on her knee and says, I could make it all go away, if you know what I mean. That's the only episode like that. For the most part, the IRS agents are actually depicted kind of neutrally to even positively. There's, in the Ellen episode that I mentioned before, where the IRS has made a mistake, the IRS official says to her, sometimes IRS stands for I'm really sorry. And there's a lot of that.
Now, you alluded earlier to an episode of Third Rock from the Sun. So that's dealing with aliens interacting with the tax system. And so what sort of things did happened in that episode?
So for those who are shockingly enough not familiar with the premise of the show, a group of aliens, I think it's 5 altogether, arrive from a distant planet to investigate Earth and to masquerade as human beings, to the better to investigate, and spend several years there. And they are much more intelligent than humans. But somehow the lead character, Dick, who's played by John Lithgow, didn't get the word for several years about the income tax. So finally, when he finds out that he has to prepare income tax returns, he starts doing it. And there's one scene where he's trying to prepare his return, and he says,
I don't understand this. I'm a superior being. I can calculate the decaying orbit of a dying moon to within 1/10 of an inch. Why can't I calculate the subtotal of line 59A?
There are a lot of episodes going way back that involve people complaining about how difficult it is to fill out a tax return, including several where the joke is they read literally from the instructions to the 1040, and just reading literally from the actual instructions is enough to produce a laugh. But this is perhaps the most extreme version of complaining about the complexity of income tax return preparation that even it actually sounds a lot like the Albert Einstein quote, which may be real or apocryphal, that the hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax. Well, these guys are smarter than Einstein. They can't understand the tax. Eventually, they conclude that they actually owe a lot of money, which if they file their returns properly, and of course they don't want to pay this. So one of the other characters says, "I've got it. We can cheat on our taxes." And the third one says, "What a great idea. I can't believe no human has thought of this before." So they cheat on their taxes, claim a huge refund instead of having a tax liability, get audited, and it turns out that they end up having to pay the taxes in the end. But it's a very nice episode. I recommend that to anyone. There's another trio of episodes that I really like that Third Rock belongs in, which you might label First Encounters with the Income Tax. They also tend to actually show some declining attitudes over time. I've actually mentioned both of the other two already, but one is the Bill Dana show where the immigrant encounters income tax for the first time and is moved to want to give the government a tip. Another is Green Acres, where the farmers belatedly find out about the income tax and decide they want the government to refund all of their farming losses, and then this is the third and most recent.
Now, so we've just recently ran your update to the original. I think it was it 2006. Your original article about
2007, December 24th, 2007.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we expect about 10 years from now another update to your list?
Well, I hope so. I've already, in a sense, although all of your readers can already find out about this, but as it happens, the week after the update was published, you got a letter to the editor from a reader who had 3 episodes that I'd missed. So, but yeah, I'm sure there will be more episodes, and I would love to do another update in about 10 years or so. I should mention that one interesting trend, which I don't have a good explanation for, is that these episodes are getting a little scarcer than they used to be. If you count the number of tax-related sitcom episodes I've been able to find per decade, starting from say I'd say that a decline started about in the 70s or maybe 80s, and it's been kind of, they've never disappeared, and I don't think they ever will disappear as long as there's an income tax, but it's kind of striking that there's a clear downward trend. So I can't promise that many more episodes, but whatever I'm able to find, you bet.
All right. Well, if our listeners have some ideas of episodes to send you, now first of all, what's the basic criteria to apply for inclusion on the list?
I'm interested only in sitcoms, and so the core of my interest is sitcoms and the federal income tax. I will admit to fudging that a little bit if I find something else that I think is really cool. So for purposes of this list, I decided that the Twilight Zone episode I mentioned was a sitcom, and there's some dramedies on the list as well, like The Wonder Years and Northern Exposure. But if something is a clear drama, that's beyond the scope. Also, if it's solely about some tax other than the income tax, that's beyond the scope as well. Ideally, the income tax is the main thing going on in the plot, but I included a lot of episodes where the income tax is a subplot as well. So basically, if it's at least arguably a sitcom, and there's a federal income tax angle, I'd be interested.
All right, Larry, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Dave. Thank you.
And now, coming attractions. Each week we highlight new and interesting commentary in our magazines. Joining me now from her home is Content and Acquisitions Manager Faye McCray. Faye, what will you have for us?
Thank you, Dave. In Tax Notes State, Robert Calafel and Alexander Dowd discuss how businesses that fall short of incentive requirements during the coronavirus pandemic should approach states and localities to mitigate problems. Paul Bogdansky, David Dorner, and Jeremy Gov discuss Illinois' requirements for establishing domicile in another state. In Tax Notes International, Matt Andrew and Richard Collier address how the coronavirus pandemic could affect the arm's length principle in the OECD's inclusive framework. Victor Adigite and Amy Dushim, with KPMG Advisory Service in Lagos, explain the OECD proposed two-pillar approach to taxing the digital economy and provide a unique perspective on key elements of the proposal. And on the opinions page, Nana Amasarfo sits down with Tiffany White King, U.S. National Tax Practice Leader at Mazars USA LLP, about her professional journey to becoming partner. William G. Gale makes a case for raising revenue with a VAT. And Roxanne Bland interviews Sunjata Yalamanchili, a partner at Hodgson Ross in Buffalo, New York. And now, for a closer look at what's new and noteworthy in our magazines, here is Tax Notes Federal Editor-in-Chief Ariel Greenblum.
Thanks, Faye. I'm here with Philip Wolf, who recently began writing a regular column for us in which he discusses his journey as a young lawyer in the tax field. Philip is joining us by phone from his home in California. Welcome, Philip. Can you give our listeners some background about how you have come up with your ideas for writing the column?
Yeah, of course. When COVID-19 happened, I actually got an email from Tax Notes, and they were saying they want people to write about topics related to COVID-19. And I just graduated from law school and passed the bar at that time, so I didn't have a lot of specific tax knowledge that I could bring out. But what I did have were my experiences. So I decided to write about how COVID-19 has affected me as a beginning lawyer. My first article, How a Tax Lawyer's Collusion with the COVID-19 Job Market Led to Opportunities, I talked about how I've been volunteering for charities that have specific tax issues arising from the virus. Tax practitioners, we have the special knowledge that we can actually volunteer with other people, and they find it very helpful. In the second article, Learning Entry-Level Skills Without an Entry-Level Job, I wrote about how losing your job because of COVID-19 can actually be an opportunity to work on skills that you need to improve. And then lastly, in my most recent article, I talked about how COVID-19 is an opportunity for me to see the tax as kind of a warm and welcoming community. I've been reaching out to tax lawyers, and they're helping me integrate myself in the tax world and treating me as a colleague, which, for instance, they've been invited to meetings, they've been giving me career advice, and in one case, one even asked me to read an article to make me feel like a peer. And kind of as for how I come up with my articles, my inspiration truly comes from my journey. I hope that others reading it will relate to what I'm writing, either as young lawyers or as seasoned practitioners who kind of remember what it's like being an entry-level associate.
You also recently wrote a special report that we published, Family Court Attorney Fees for Innocent Spouses in Tax Court. Could you give us some takeaways from that one?
Absolutely. So as tax practitioners, we sometimes come across innocent spouse cases before the IRS related divorces. Usually what kind of happens is there's one spouse who, either through incompetence or through malice, is trying to use the tax court to play out drama arising from divorce proceedings in the family court. So I did some digging around, and in California, there are actually special provisions and quite a bit of case law where the family court can actually order a spouse that's acting maliciously or incompetently to pay the attorney's fees of the innocent spouse in any proceedings related to the marriage, including tax cases. The best thing about these provisions is they don't have to be in the state of California, And the innocent spouse can get the fees at the beginning of the case, and they don't even have to show that they're going to win the case. They just have to show that there's a financial need. Now, for tax lawyers, this is actually quite a benefit because the tax lawyer is the person who gets to write the entire declaration, and then they get brought in for all the tax work in the case. So this is good for the tax practitioner. It's also great because there are a lot of innocent spouses who might have big cases but might not be able to pay for those cases or get representation. So you're actually doing a service for these people. So you're putting the malicious spouse in a position where he has to fund the innocent spouse's court costs. So the malicious spouse is now incentivized to behave reasonably.
All right. Thank you so much, Philip. Before we let you go, could you tell our listeners where they can find you online?
I have a LinkedIn profile. You can search for me under Philip Wolf, Philip, Wolf, like the animal. I also now have a Twitter. So my Twitter is Philip, Philip_Wolf, like the animal, 10.
You can find Philip's articles online at taxnotes.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Tax Analyst, for more in-depth discussions about what's new and noteworthy in our magazines. Again, that's Tax Analyst with an S. Back to you, Dave.
You can read all that and a lot more in the pages of Tax Notes Federal, State, and International. That's it for this week. You can follow me online at TaxStew, that's STEW, and be sure to follow at Tax Notes for all things tax. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@taxanalyst.org. And as always, if you like what we're doing here, please leave a rating or review wherever you download this podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode of Tax Notes Talk.
Tax Notes Talk is a production of Tax Notes. You can learn more about us by visiting www.taxnotes.com/podcast. When major media wants the straight story, they turn to Tax Notes. Thank you for listening, and join us again for another edition of Tax Notes Talk. Tax Analyst Inc. does not provide tax advice or tax preparation services. Nothing in the podcast constitutes legal, accounting, or tax advice. A full disclaimer is included in the transcript.